professor, and I'm going to be the instructor for the course. You'll hear my voice throughout these lectures. You won't see my face in the lectures. What you'll see is you'll see slides as I'm going through, and you'll hear my voice describe those slides. And hopefully that will give you a better lecture experience than just kind of watching me talk. It has some pros and cons versus doing a Zoom lecture. The Zoom lectures, I think, are quite good and a nice way to do a lecture, but they do fix the time, and that doesn't work for everybody. So to add flexibility to the course, I'm recording the lectures, and you can listen to them whenever you want. And if you have questions, and it'll give us a lot more time for questions, you can stop by my office hours. My office hours are 2 to 3:30 on Tuesdays and 1 to 2:30 on Fridays. Hopefully those will be times that'll work for everybody. If they can't, though, send me an email or a note through Carmen, and we'll set up a time and we can chat over Zoom. I will be on Zoom during all those times. You can just pop on, and I'll always post a link to the Zoom session in Carmen under the announcements, and you can stop by and we can chat. Hopefully we'll get to know each other fairly well, even though this isn't an in-person class. And we'll have a couple opportunities to interact. I'm going to do an oral exam as I describe the course in a little bit, both the midterm and the final. And I really am looking forward to getting to know you, even though it's a fairly large class, even though it's online. Hopefully we can bridge all of those gaps by having lots of time to chat during the week, during office hours or other times, as that makes sense. Let me start, before I actually get into the lecture, saying a little bit about the course. The course is kind of divided up into two halves. The first half of the course is really looking at what leads people to stereotype others, to be prejudiced. And I have a book for you to read during that part by Jennifer Eberhard. The title of the book is called Biased. Jennifer is a social psychologist at Stanford, and she's a fabulous scholar. She covers the research on stereotyping and prejudice, what leads to that, really quite well in the book. But I'm going to emphasize slightly different things. There'll be about 70% overlap in terms of the material. You'll write a book report on that book. That'll be about 15% of your grade. Well, it'll be 15% of your grade. And there'll be an oral exam at the end of that first section of the course that we'll schedule to do over Zoom. An oral exam maybe isn't something that you're used to. I'll give you a bunch of different questions that may be asked. I'll pick questions at random. There'll be big, broad questions that you'll know ahead of time are going to be on it. I might reserve even one question, though, that is a big, broad issue that you should be able to say something about that I won't even tell you ahead of time. We'll sort out all those details later. But you shouldn't be too freaked out by an oral exam. We can do it in 15 minutes. One of the nice things about an oral exam is if you don't understand something, I can ask questions and clarify. You can tell me what you do know about it, but the little bit that you don't know about it. And it makes it easy to have like partial credit for a question and so forth in a way that you can't in a standard exam. The second half of the course is going to look at what are the consequences of stereotyping and prejudice for people who have to face those challenges, those biases in their life on a daily basis. And for this half of the course, you'll read a book called Whistling Vivaldi by Claude Steele. Claude Steele is a graduate of the social psychology program here at Ohio State. He was at University of Wisconsin for quite some time, University of Michigan, Stanford University. He went on to be the provost at Columbia, the provost at UC Berkeley. He's now back at the psychology department at Stanford in a retired status. Claude was also my PhD advisor. The book is a really interesting book, I think, because it actually is more of a memoir, a bit of Claude's life, about how his experience in life led to research, and then what's the story behind the scenes in the research. And you'll even, if you look closely, you'll even see that I'm discussed a little bit in that book as the research that's described as research that we did together. Um, There'll be lectures, though, on topics related to what are the consequences of having to face bias and stereotypes and prejudice in your life. And the overlap is different in this section. Although Claude does describe the research quite well, he gives the behind-the-scenes story of the research, which is kind of interesting. I'll cover a few things that aren't in the book because the book is a little bit more narrow-focused. Again, the book report will be 15% of your grade, and the oral exam for that section of the course will be 20% of your grade. There's a couple group projects that are worth 5% of your grade. There are 2 short application papers that are worth 5% of your grade. And if you've been adding up the percentages, that's 90% of your grade there. The last 10% are various activities. Each week you will have an activity of some sort that you're supposed to be doing. This week it's really quite simple. You just describe your course. You provide me a description of yourself and tell me why you took the course. Next week, you're going to fill out some questionnaires on stereotyping and prejudice and some related issues, and we'll talk about that. I think it's important for you to understand the experience of people who fill out questionnaires as you think about what the results that we see and we talk about are like. Because a fair bit of research on stereotyping and prejudice just has people fill out questionnaires. We do that a couple of times in the course. There's a couple other assignments that you're going to do throughout the course as well. Some self-reflection of when things have happened to you in your own life. So that's the basic outline of what the course is going to be. If you haven't gotten the books yet, both of them have sold pretty widely in the general market. You're quite likely to be able to get a used book fairly cheap. Even new, you can get them both in paperback, and they're really not expensive at all. I hate to endorse any one company, but it's awful easy to get them from Amazon or whatever your favorite online book retailer is. I think you can probably, if you live in Columbus and you want to go to the regular bookstore, they may very well have copies. I haven't ordered them there because it's an online course, and I figure people may be getting the book from other places. All right, so that's the basics of what the course is and what we're going to do in the course. Today for lecture, what I'm going to talk about is basic research methodology. And if you haven't noticed already in the description of the course really is about research on stereotyping and prejudice. And so I think it's important that you understand really what is the scientific study of stereotyping and prejudice. What's the approach that you take? And we're going to look at that at kind of a broad abstract level, the philosophy behind why we do science. And that's something that often is unsaid and isn't described. So I want to start there today and think about really what are we trying to do when we do research and scientific research, particularly, and stereotyping and prejudice. And then I want to talk a little bit about the history of stereotyping and prejudice. And stereotyping and prejudice is intimately tied to the American experience. So we got to talk a little bit about that American experience. We're going to talk about the research that's been done in stereotyping and prejudice. And we're going to see, just like the rest of society, some of the research in stereotyping and prejudice has really worked at addressing the issue and trying to reduce those problematic aspects of society. But and I'll mention and talk a little bit about, really though, even within science, as we're going to see as we talk about basic research methodology, does not protect people from engaging in racism. So the scientific study of psychology has its own racist past, and we'll own up to that and try and be clear about what that is in terms of the lecture today as well. All right. So let's begin with some basic research methodology. Now, many people think about science as demonstrating facts of the way that the world works. That's actually completely backwards. What science is really much more about, and what it really begins with, is the basic insight that our ideas can often be wrong. And I don't know anybody who is a scientist, and particularly in psychology and in more specifically stereotyping and prejudice, that doesn't realize that the majority of the ideas that they have and that they test out tend to be wrong. And really, science is about the process of going out to demonstrate that your ideas are wrong, and that we never prove that they're right. But what we can do is, when they've held up to a test where we've really set out to demonstrate that they're wrong, we can for a while accept them for now because they've held up to that test. Turns out the majority of our ideas, they're wrong, and we can actually demonstrate that they're wrong. But when we can't, we accept them for now in light of the way they've held up to the particular test that we've set up. So really, about testing ideas has to be able to be a demonstration in that test that the ideas are wrong. It's not really science if you can't, when you're testing ideas, demonstrate that they're wrong. If you could only demonstrate that they're right and not demonstrate that they're wrong, then then that's not science. You have to be able to, and you actually set out to have a real test that would demonstrate your ideas are wrong, and that happens all the time. But this also means we may very well prove that our ideas are wrong later. And the history of science is full of examples where there were ideas that were accepted for now that actually later on, and held up to some really good tests, sometimes even for hundreds of years, that later on we were able to demonstrate that those ideas are wrong. If we want to go back thousands of years, we can look at astronomy. Early astronomers believed that the Earth was the center of the universe and everything revolved around the Earth. Now, if you go out on a cloudless night where there isn't light around, and of course there wasn't really light around in a couple thousand years ago, and there isn't much light around, you can follow the stars as they move around the sky from night to night. Well, early astronomers made orbits of those stars based on where they showed up in the night, with the Earth at the center. Now, many of the stars, that held up pretty well, the orbits, until they were really careful with how they looked at that. And then they scratched their head and said, this doesn't really work. About 500 years ago, Copernicus, Galileo, a few others realized, well, maybe it isn't that the Earth's the center of the universe, maybe it's the sun. And if you put the sun at the center of the universe, when you're looking at least the planets, Mars, Venus, Jupiter, which are easy to see in the night sky, you realize that, well, that's much better. The orbits just work much better. The math works so much better if you put the sun at the center of the universe. But it turns out when you look at other stars that aren't planets, that still kind of sucks. So that was an idea. It wasn't easy to prove that the Earth was not the center of the universe. People accepted that for a long time, but it was proved later that it was wrong. Moving for the sun to be the center of the universe, that worked for some things, but it was easy to prove later that that's wrong too. Now we have no clue what the center of the universe is. We can do the same thing with physics. Let's take, for example, Newton's views on what the universe was like and what gravity is like. Those were ideas that held up to some pretty stringent tests. But it turns out when you do more complicated tests like out in space, it's easy to prove that some of those ideas are completely wrong. And New ideas had to be developed later with physics, and includes things like Einstein's general theory of relativity, which really did call into question some of the fundamental things that people thought about the universe based on Newton's conceptions of physics. So just because we accept an idea for now doesn't mean that it won't be proven wrong later. And even when it's proven wrong later, sometimes, but not always, there's still some important truths in those understandings. So like thinking the sun was the center of the universe, it is the center of the solar system. The sun is. It is the center, and everything orbits around the sun in it. Now, it's actually thinking the sun's the center of the universe works great for everything in the solar system. Doesn't work so well for everything else. That's often the way it is. When we prove ideas are wrong later, we realize the scope with which the ideas are right and the scope with which they're wrong. And that's very important as we make progress in science. So what's accepted for now, what we have to keep in mind is the process of science determines what's accepted for now, but it's not completely objective and immune from other influences. It's influenced by what's popular. Certainly popular views and how popular views are affect what's accepted for now. And it's even shaped by political forces and the political impact that it has. When we think about racism in psychology in particular, if we look at the early 20th century, what people accepted about views of even what race is, and even what and the relative value of different races was hugely influenced by the very conservative, fascist, in some cases explicitly Nazi political forces of the day. So even some of the people who are famous psychologists, like Hans Eysenck, turns out he was a virulent racist, and he believed some really horrible things about differences between races. And why was that accepted at the time? Well, the political forces at the time certainly allowed the acceptance of things that really there wasn't any data about. So we can't think that science is immune to these things. Science can provide an antidote to those things, I would like to argue, though, by looking and providing new data demonstrating that those ideas are wrong. It's not as if data don't matter. Data do matter. Data do matter and influence the debate significantly. But sometimes people prematurely accept things just based on political forces. Okay, let's look at some ways of doing research. Now, when we talk about doing research, we should keep in mind that there's always a tension between discovering new things and explaining old things. And quite often when we're doing research, the point of the research is to more fully explain what the ideas are and try and understand what's the thing that causes the thing that we understand now. That's more of a study about explanation. Other times, research is really about discovering new things. Now, even if we take the example of astronomy with research, now astronomy is one of those disciplines that emphasizes discovery, finding a black hole, finding a new galaxy. Discovery is hugely important. But as we were just talking about, there's also explanations with astronomy. The whole debate about what the center of the universe is about is an explanation of what you see in the sky, if you're an astronomist, if you're an astronomer. That's what the whole debate is about. Every discipline, even one is heavily skewed towards discovery, also cares about explanation. Now, when we discover something, we also have to keep in mind it counts as a discovery only if you can see it over and over again. And astronomy is another good example. If you see a galaxy way, way out there and you can't see it again, is it really a discovery? We count discoveries. We really need to be able to repeat it again. We need to be able to see the same sorts of things again. And repeatability or replication is important for demonstrating a discovery. And that has led to various crises throughout all of science about are our basic discoveries replicable? And it turns out that some of the discoveries that people have aren't replicable. It isn't the case, and nobody should think just because somebody has done a study and you have an effect that you'll automatically get it again. Sometimes that doesn't happen. If we look at the broad course and we look at things over a long period of time, we can see that scientific discoveries and explanation have led us to, in certain very concrete ways, think about the world as a better place. One of the things that we know with pretty fair certainty is in the last 100 years, people live a lot longer. And why do they live a lot longer? Well, there are a whole bunch of different medical discoveries which we can put together that antibiotics, good sewer systems, treatments for heart disease, even in the last 30 years, better treatments for heart disease allows people to live longer. When I was a kid, I'm old enough now, I'm 54, so I'm old. When I was a kid, I remember my grandmother having open heart surgery, and I was really very worried that she was quite likely to die fairly soon. That doesn't happen now. People have open heart surgery regularly, and it doesn't necessarily, the condition she had, they probably wouldn't even do open heart surgery anymore. They'd do a stent, and I mean, she had some clogged blood vessels on her heart. It's like a no big deal now type of thing nowadays. Not like absolutely nothing, but nothing like it was when I was just a kid. So what we see is we can see progress, but that doesn't mean each step forward, each discovery is actually replicable. That's something that has to be sorted out over time. And just like if we think about the examples from astronomy or physics, sometimes you don't get replication because we don't understand the sphere in which certain explanations actually work. We don't understand, like for example, with the astronomy example, putting the Earth at the center of the universe works really well for the solar system, but it's kind of crappy for everything else. Sometimes we don't get replication because you're not looking to play out that analogy. You're not looking at things in the solar system anymore. And then the sun doesn't work. It doesn't replicate that it's the center of the universe. So sometimes we need to understand where things fit in the progress of research and understand the boundaries of which theories and ideas work and when they don't work. Now, when we think about explanation in psychology, what we're talking about often is psychological mechanisms. We know that something happens, but we don't know the psychological reason why it's happened. And I would argue that understanding psychological mechanisms is important because it helps you develop your theory and test ideas about the theory that could be wrong. And it's an idea for you to develop your understanding because you can find sometimes, well, those ideas happen in this area but not in that area, or just that idea, that explanation of why you observed what you do is not the right idea. So psychological mechanisms are important, and we'll talk about that throughout the course. But understand that psychological mechanisms are an extension of the theory that provides just another test of that theory. And lastly, I want to draw upon the study of science and the way science proceeds and draw upon a particular concept from Thomas Kuhn. And this is, you probably heard about this before, it's in everyday language anymore, is what Kuhn called paradigm shifts. Paradigm shifts are when you quit thinking about the world in one way and you begin thinking about it in a very different way. Classic examples in science for astronomy, we've talked about one of them already, thinking about the Earth or the Sun as the center of the universe, or thinking, like, as they do now, there's no center of the universe. In physics, thinking about Newtonian physics or Einstein's theory of general relativity. Those are huge paradigm shifts in the way you think about the world. In biology, between thinking about where the relation of species is merely categorization and thinking about them in terms of evolutionary theory, one of the huge paradigm shifts. In chemistry, thinking of atoms as the smallest unit of any given substance and realizing that they're subatomic particles. Big, huge paradigm shifts. Every field has a paradigm shift. Psychology has certainly had its share. Social psychology has had its share. They're not as big as the ones we're talking about there, but even the study of stereotyping and prejudice has had its share. I would argue that the division in this class between studying what leads to stereotyping and prejudice and looking at the consequences of stereotyping and prejudice for those who have to face bias, that actually was a paradigm shift that happened in the 1990s in social psychology and in the study of stereotyping and prejudice, that all of a sudden it became crucially important to study not just what leads to stereotyping and prejudice, but what the consequences of bias really is. Now, when we think, and Kuhn classified it this way, when we think about paradigm shifts, that changes the way the field studies and what they study, versus what he called mundane science. And mundane science is really the study of, in a very incremental way, of the things that have already been known in the field. And related to the tension between discovery and replication is it's discoveries that tend to lead to paradigm shifts as they provide a new way to think about the field and the world. And it is mundane science that carries out the understanding of explanation. And both of them are crucial and central to the way research actually happens. And Kuhn calls what leads to paradigm shifts revolutionary science. And that sort of revolutionary science, which is a totally different way of understanding the field and the world, and a new theoretical interpretation, is almost inevitably related to discovery. Whereas mundane science is much more related to explanation. Okay, let's go on and talk about what research, and this is going to be more mundane science for stereotyping and prejudice. What is the research and why do people do what they do? Let's start by talking about surveys. And why do people do surveys? Well, the reason people want to do surveys is they want to characterize a wide swath of people without having to ask all of them the questions. And what's important for surveys is the people who you ask the questions of, they have to be representative of the bigger group. So you want surveys to be representative of a group of people. And the way you do that is you randomly select, or you randomly sample from that bigger group of people a smaller group. And as long as you carefully randomly select or randomly sample those people, you will get a good representativeness within, and you'll know how much air based on how many people you ask. You'll know kind of how good of a picture is it. And it's really possible to take 2,000 people and have a good representative description of what everybody in the United States looks like. And that's hugely important for trying to establish what's going on out there in the world. And for stereotyping and prejudice, it's actually, we're going to talk even later when we talk about the history of some surveys and what do those surveys tell us about society and about racism in society. That's going to be really interesting questions. But if it's really going to tell us about society, the people who answer the questions have to be representative of society. You need to do other things well. You need to ask questions that are unbiased. Surveys can be messed up and influenced in all kinds of inappropriate ways by asking the questions in biased ways and purposely biasing the questions. A great example, if you want to ask people about are they in favor of a new law about increasing taxes? If you ask them ahead of time, do you think you pay too much in taxes? And then you ask them, what do you think about this particular law about taxes? Well, they're going to be thinking about how much they're paying in taxes right at that moment, and that is going to influence their questions about the new law. There are many ways to bias questions. Good surveys do everything they can to try and make the questions as unbiased as possible. Completely unbiased, probably not possible. But it is something that a survey researcher really needs to strive to do. Okay, surveys, what do? Surveys are really good at establishing correlations. When one thing happens, another thing happens. If people prefer living in the suburbs, they score higher in racism. I'm not sure that's an actual correlation. I suspect it very well might be, but I don't know that it actually is a correlation. But we know in that case, it's a hypothetical example, that people who tend to live in the suburbs tend to score higher in racism. Now, does that tell us that if you move to the suburbs, you'll be more racist? No. As we're going to see, there's a difference, and it's one of the fundamental things you need to learn in this course, between things that are correlated with one another and things that actually are causally related to one another. And that's what I want to explain next. And I'm going to take the example, does economic hardship cause prejudice? So you could ask yourself, does people who have economic hardship, you could think about that if you found that people who have more economic hardship are more prejudiced. That's a correlation. You could think maybe economic hardship causes prejudice. That would be one way to think about it. But you could imagine the reverse happening as well, that prejudice causes economic hardship. Could be the case that people who are prejudiced don't get along with their coworkers. And because they don't get along with their coworkers, they actually have trouble at work and lose their job more often. So I could imagine, if I see a correlation between economic hardship and prejudice, that maybe there's a story, economic hardship causes people to be defensive, and as they're defensive, they like to look down upon other people, and that economic hardship actually causes prejudice. Now, by the way, one of the earliest findings that in social psychology, which we're going to talk a little bit about later, and it's actually it was social science at that time. Psychology hardly existed. Researchers studied the relationship between economic hardship and extreme racism in the southern U.S., lynchings. And one of the oldest correlations is that the price of cotton is correlated with the number of lynchings. Now, the story there, it's called the frustration aggression hypothesis, which we'll talk about later in class, is that when economic hardship is reflected in lower cotton prices, which really meant in the southern U.S. at that time, the economy was really in trouble when cotton prices dropped, that led to prejudice in the extreme form of lynchings. You could even in that example, though, think about it the other way around. We only know those two things together. If people are being such cruel and awful idiots that they're lynching people, and that's what they're spending their time on, maybe they're not getting their work done. And maybe that's causing the economic hardship. I'm not saying that's all that plausible, but you could tell a story that it's the actual racism and prejudice of people and focusing on that and focusing away from their work and their daily activities that's leading to the economic hardship. Alternatively, you could imagine that there's a third variable that's causing both of those things. Or that it's happening through something else. Actually, I would prefer at the bottom there that something else, the arrow was the other direction. There's a third thing where that causes both economic hardship and causes prejudice. And, with the cotton pricing and lynching as example, you could imagine extreme weather being the example. Extreme weather and the heat and frustration that happened at that time from that extreme weather could lead to more prejudice against people who you can take that out on in society. And that was black people in the southern U.S., as sad as that is to say. You could also lead to economic hardship, and you could imagine that actually as well. So the something else in this case, we could say extreme weather could lead to prejudice and economic hardship. Now, the argument says in this example is at the top. But if you really want to establish not just a correlation, but causation, then you really need to do three things. We need to know that correlation is not causation. You need correlation in order to establish causation. When one changes, the other changes. When cotton prices go down, lynchings go up. But you need to establish time order as well. Causes have to happen before effects. So if we're going to say one thing causes another, it has to happen first. And so one of the things you need to demonstrate if you want to have causation is when these two things are correlated, the cause always happens before the effect. So you want to start by establishing that's what causes what's called time order. And so which comes first? Causes must precede effects. And you want to be able to establish that. But the key thing is, just like that example we were talking about, you got to eliminate all the other possible causes. And when we do experiments, and the reason we do experiments is experiments let us go beyond correlation to actual causation. And the way they do that is random, not sampling, not random selection, but random assignment of people to different conditions. Random sampling, which we saw in surveys, was about taking a small group of people to represent a big whole. Random assignment takes everybody, but randomly puts them in one condition or another. So let's think about this with the economic hardship and prejudice example that we were talking about earlier. If we are going to set up an experiment to try and demonstrate this in the lab, it's not going to be super easy. In order to do that, we have to create economic hardship in one condition, not in another. After we do that, we have to measure prejudice after the fact. So economic hardship happens first, prejudice happens later. And the only differences between those two conditions should be the random assignment of people to it. Then we know that it's not anything about any other causes. We know why people were in one condition or the other. Randomness. We flipped a coin and they were heads or tails. That's not an alternative explanation, or we can more appropriately, we can know the chances of that actually happen because that follows the laws of probability. We know how likely it is that the group differed by chance. Not very likely. Okay, so the independent variables in an experiment are what were causing the hardship. So what we might want to do in an experiment, if we were going to do this, is we could have people come in and we give them $100. In one condition, we have them play a game that's rigged, and we take away $90 from them by playing this game. In the other condition, they play a game that isn't rigged. And they, on average, they get to keep the $100, and they get a lot more money as a whole in the experimental or in the control condition than the experimental condition. Now, if we randomly assign people to the two conditions, where one group gets all this money and then loses it, and the other group basically doesn't lose much money, we know that the difference between those two conditions is totally due to chance, because we randomly assign people to the experimental condition and the control condition. So there's an experimental group and there's a control group. And then we'd want to measure a dependent variable. We'd want some measure of prejudice. Now, we could do this in a number of different ways. Not always easy when you do experiments to come up with a good way to measure prejudice. But let's say it's simple. Let's have them just fill out a prejudice scale. But for good dependent variables to work, they need to be two things. They need to be valid and they need to be reliable. Now, valid and reliable may sound alike. Sometimes people misuse them interchangeably, but they're not. A valid measure measures what it's supposed to measure. And as you're going to see when you fill out the prejudice scales next week, you can ask yourself, is this a valid measure of prejudice? Is it really measuring prejudice? Is this really what prejudice is all about? That is a broader and deeper question about whether what you're measuring is actually what you say it is. And it's important to demonstrate that any of the variables are valid. They're actually instantiations of the general idea you're trying to test. And with any experiment, you have to go from a theoretical idea to a specific, what's called operational idea. So I did that already with the independent variables. I said, well, let's give them $100 and have one side, we rig the game so almost everybody loses almost all the money. And the other side, we don't rig the game so they get to keep it. That is going from the operational or from the theoretical idea of economic hardship to an operation, a specific instantiation of that idea. And the question is that a valid one? And that's always a question that needs to be asked. Same thing with dependent variables. If we take and it's especially important for dependent variables, if we take a prejudice scale, is that really about prejudice, or did somebody just call it a prejudice scale? And so that's one of the things that you really have to demonstrate, and there's all kinds of work about how you can do that. And we'll talk a little bit about this on the course. That's a higher level class, but it's important to keep that in mind. Now, whether something is reliable is totally different. Something is reliable if you get the same thing over and over again. On a prejudice scale, that means you answer the different questions in similar sort of ways. And you can measure that reliability statistically on a scale. If they answer question 1 this way, do they ask question 2 in a similar sort of way? If you're arguing that it's a valid measure of one construct, people should be answering the questions in similar sorts of ways. At another level, though, reliable is also about you get the same thing over and over again. So reliable is about, does that measure produce the same results over and over again, either within itself or between time points? Those are different aspects of reliability, but reliable is, do you get the same thing? Now, you can have something that's totally invalid and very reliable. You can have something that's totally valid and totally unreliable. These constructs are different from one another. Something can be measuring what it's supposed to measure, but it's not going to be very reliable. If we're looking at prejudice, lynchings were a very valid measure of prejudice. I don't think anybody questions if somebody's lynched, that's about prejudice in the South. That's what it was about. But would you get the same people lynching people over and over again? Well, maybe, but there's got to be times that I'm not going to do that, and it wouldn't be all that reliable. At the same way, some scales, you get people answering the questions very much the same way, but they're lying through their teeth. They're not telling you the truth when they're answering those scales. That's a reliable scale, but it's totally invalid because people aren't being truthful. You want both. Okay, notice in this experiment, time order is built in. The little experiment we're doing, economic frustration leading to prejudice. The economic frustration happened before we measured prejudice. And said another way, our independent variables here lead to our dependent variables. Prejudice is built in. And notice that we're eliminating other causes because we randomly assign people to the two conditions. The only difference between the two conditions is chance. And one game takes stuff away, the other game doesn't. So we can say the economic hardship, as we operationalized it, led to prejudice as we operationalized it. So establishing causality and testing theories, what does this mean? Let's ask a few other questions here. What does this mean for a study to have internal validity? Well, an internal validity study means that the operationalizations we have are valid. For it to have internal validity, are valid manifestations of the theoretical variables of interest. Notice that when you do experiments, one of the key things you have to think about is how do you take that theoretical idea and make it into a very specific idea? And that sort of internal validity is actually very, very crucial. It is a very different thing, which we're going to talk about in a second, external validity. So internal validity is, did you operationalize things well? Did you take the theoretical ideas and turn them into specific ideas in a good way? Now, keep in mind when we're thinking about establishing internal validity and when we're thinking about establishing causes and further explanations, we could ask ourselves about intervening causes. And those are the tests of explanation of psychological mechanisms. So if, in our example, the economic hardship led to greater prejudice, one important theory would say the reason it did that is because people were frustrated. So we could have an experiment that broke that apart, where we could have, instead of prejudice being the dependent variable, we could make frustration the dependent variable, where frustration is caused by economic hardship, and then you would need to show separately that frustration, what other operationalization you use to that, causes prejudice. So if economic economic hardship causes frustration, which causes prejudice, you can test this theory more carefully, and there's another opportunity to show that it's wrong. That sort of explanation tells us what about economic hardship would lead to prejudice. So you gain a further explanation and a further test of the theory. Notice it's not going to probably upend the whole theory to do that sort of a test, but it is making progress towards further understanding. Okay, what about external validity? External validity means that the operationalizations you picked in that study are good general examples, and what you find in that one study would happen if you did totally different operationalizations in a totally different setting, and it really tests how much the findings you have apply out there in the real world. So a study can be perfectly internally valid, but it doesn't tell you much at all what happens in the real world, because the kind of things that you looked at in the study are not the kind of things that matter in the real world. What you really want to argue is not only that you have internal validity, but what you had there, you're understanding the important causal things that are matter in the real world. So you need, in addition to internal validity, external validity. And that understanding causation can lead to interventions to change the world to make it a better place. Give you an example of this. One of the classic theories that we're going to talk about in this class is is what's called the contact theory. And there were a bunch of studies that were done in the early 1950s, late 1940s, early 1950s, on if you had interracial contact, would people get along better, and would that help the and this was done with blacks and white, would that help blacks do better in that situation? Those individual studies were important for having internal validity, for demonstrating the importance of contact for improving intergroup relations, particularly relations between blacks and whites. But the question is, did that matter in the real world? And the question about where did it matter in the real world is, did it matter in the real world particularly for school integration? And when it came to the Brown versus Board of Education in 1957, they pointed to that research and suggested, if we integrate schools, we're going to improve relations between blacks and whites, and it will be better for black kids if we do that. And part of the argument was based on those experiments in social psychology. That's a question of external validity. What you found in the studies, will that extend to school integration? Okay, so that's where we're at in terms of methodology. Those are the basic things I'd want you to understand. Let me give you an end today with a brief history of stereotyping and prejudice in society and in academia in particular. So let's think a little bit about stereotyping and prejudice in society. What we find if we turn to the 20th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, the 1900s, between 1900 and 1930, you may not have realized, but if you think about it historically, it probably makes sense, that there was tremendous prejudice in American society in the early 1900s, but it wasn't just in the US, it was also in Europe. This prejudice led to the rise of fascism in Europe, but the U.S. was not immune to this. Within academic psychology, there were out-and-out racist theories of superiorities of some races over others. Interestingly, it maps more onto Nazi psychology, although in some ways it's just dividing up and saying whites are better, but especially Aryan whites are better. Those horrible ideas were expressed in the racist history of studying stereotyping and prejudice. But there were some glimmers of hope. I think one of the things that actually related to this, that actually changed the study of stereotyping and prejudice in the U.S., was the immigration from Europe of particularly a large number of Jewish scholars who understood very much the way that prejudice and stereotyping could play hugely detrimental roles in societies. And of course, coming from Europe, where Jewish people were at the bottom of the rung and viewed as so horrible that fascists really wanted to kill them and openly advocated killing them. And of course, Nazi Germany did kill 6 million Jewish people based on these beliefs. They understood fully the strength and the vehemence of such negative stereotyping. Now, early on in social psychology, in 1933, there was a classic study by Katz and Braley. And this is part of the Jewish immigration to academic psychology as they were looking at it. And if you understand what's going on here in 1933, you can you can understand that this really is marking, although not in a systematic representative way, but it's marking the extent of the virulence of stereotyping and prejudice in this early 20th century. These studies were done with 100 men and all white men, and actually all white non-Jewish men in 1933. It changed as time went on. Studies done at Princeton University. Later on, they did have a little bit broader groups, but they repeated this study 4 times. And all they did is they took a number of ethnic groups and a whole bunch of adjectives, like 120 adjectives, almost all the adjectives in the a really big group of adjectives representing all kinds of things from a dictionary. And they said, which adjectives go with which groups? And they looked at the agreement between those 100 people about which adjectives go with which group. And this is what you see for stereotypes of blacks in 4 different generations. They did it in 1933, 1951, 1967, and for blacks they did it also in 1982. And what you see if we look in 1933 is just the huge, awful stereotyping and prejudice. 84 of the 100 endorsed that blacks were superstitious, 75% that they were lazy, 22% stupid, and those go down as time goes on. Particularly those really strong negative ones. Ignorant, the same sort of things. There are some positive ones. Those kind of wax and wane. There's not a clear pattern. Happy-go-lucky, I suppose, is good. Musical kind of goes up and down. Ostentatious kind of goes up and down. Very religious goes up and down. The negative ones really drop over time. They didn't do 1982. They didn't include Jewish people in the group. Look at how negative they are for Jewish people, too, and how stereotypic those are. These are almost out of Nazi propaganda. Shrewd, mercenary, industrious, but not in a good way. Grasping, ambitious. And these generally drop. But again, the particularly negative ones, the shrewd and mercenary, and are the ones that drop over time for Jewish people as well. So what we see from the early 20th century to the late 20th century is a drop in stereotyping and prejudice. We can see it in these classic studies. They're not very representative. They go back a little further, which is a nice way to look at that. I think what's more clear is survey results. And starting in 1950, there started to be representative samples of the whole U.S. asking interesting questions about race. So the results that I'm going to show you, are a classic example of racism and the dropping of racism and prejudice in society. So these are 2 questions from the National Opinion Research Council General Survey of Americans. So one question was, and notice, I guess this starts in 1960, not in the 1950s. Would you move if blacks moved into your neighborhood? Which seems like a pretty racist thing to do, just because you don't find anything out about the people, but you're going to sell your house, move, go someplace else. It's actually very practically important for white flight and a number of other things. But would you move? 80% of whites in 1960 said they'd move. Notice, though, how much that drops by 1990. It drops to 22%. But also notice that's still 22% of whites are saying something that I think is pretty unambiguously racist. Would you move if a black family moved into your neighborhood? And there's still 22% of people would say, yep, I'm selling my house and getting out. Related to this question, should whites be able to keep blacks out of their neighborhood and prevent them from moving in? This is a blatant endorsement of discrimination. Basically, should whites be able to discriminate against blacks, and specifically in housing? We get almost 60% of whites endorsing that discrimination in 1960, and we still get 18% in 1990. Huge drop. So there's two things I want you to get from this survey data, what indicates about prejudice. First of all, between 1960 and 1990s, there was a civil rights movement. It seems to have had an impact. There's a big reduction in prejudice. At the same time, it's not as if blatant prejudice doesn't still exist. We have almost 20% of people in 1990, and by the way, the numbers have been pretty flat since 1990. We could extend them out till today, and they're pretty flat. You got a huge, about somewhere between a fifth and a third, and a quarter of whites saying it's okay. No, not just saying it's okay. Say whites should be able to discriminate against blacks. They should be able to not allow them to move into their neighborhood. Okay. So we have that dramatic decrease, but it's not as if explicit prejudice isn't there. And despite that, we also see that subtler forms of prejudice are quite common in society. Some classic studies from that same era, the 1980s and 1990s. One of